Think your job is tough? Try being a Roman peasant. No bread to spare. No rest without guilt. And the man who owns your field is draped in silk, counting coins in the city, while you bleed into his soil. When we think of ancient Rome, we picture emperors in togas, marble columns, and gladiators battling in arenas. But the true Romans lived in the dust, in the cracked hands of men who sowed wheat for others to eat, in the smoke-filled huts where women spun wool and watched the skies for signs of rain. Because 9 out of 10 people in the empire weren't wealthy. They weren't even comfortable. They were farmers, laborers, and tenant workers, scraping by with whatever the land, and their landlords, allowed. They were born into labor, into silence, into fields that demanded everything and promised little in return. So what was daily life really like for the average Roman peasant? Let's time travel back to the dusty edge of the empire. By the 1st century AD, if you lived in the Roman countryside, there was no such thing as sleeping in. Your body ran on sunlight, and your life depended on beating it to the fields. Most mornings began in complete darkness, guided by the smell of wood smoke and the clatter of wooden sandals. If you had a rooster, congratulations. You had an alarm clock. Breakfast was quick and utilitarian. A chunk of old bread, maybe soaked in wine mixed with water. Not exactly a continental breakfast, but it was just enough to keep you moving until mid-morning. Those were the lucky days, when your bread came with olives, or even a bit of cheese. From there, it was out to the fields. Work varied by season, but the pattern was constant. Toil. You might be plowing rows, guiding a heavy wooden blade through stubborn soil while urging along your oxen, if you had any. Without animals, you pulled the plow yourself. And yes, it was awful. Children as young as 6 were out there too, chasing birds from crops, fetching water, or helping with planting. There was no concept of childhood as we know it. You worked as soon as you were physically able. Women juggled everything, caring for infants, managing food, and still helping in the fields or spinning wool for trade. Free time? Only if the gods allowed. And even then, it came with strings. Religious festivals and feast days gave occasional breaks, but these weren't vacations. They were dictated by the Roman calendar, and even those could be interrupted if your ox wandered off or if your roof started leaking. Survival came first, always. To be a Roman peasant was to be in a constant staring contest with the land. You gave everything to it. Sweat, labor, prayers, and sometimes it gave something back. Sometimes it didn't. Every harvest was a high-stakes game between you, nature, and fate. The farming year never stopped. In spring, the soil had to be plowed and seeded before the rains ran out. Summer was a weeds paradise, and without modern herbicides, that meant hours on your knees pulling them by hand. If even a few rows went untended, your harvest, and your family's food supply, was in danger. And don't forget pests, locusts, beetles, mice. They were just as hungry as you. By autumn, you were in a race against the clock. Harvesting was grueling. Sickle in hand, you'd cut wheat, barley, or whatever you could grow before the rains returned. One storm could ruin everything. Grain was threshed with wooden flails, then stored in clay jars or stone silos, hopefully sealed well enough to keep out rats and damp. Winter didn't mean rest, it meant repairs. You sharpened tools, patched roofs, and mended fences. You checked on your animals. If you had sheep, goats, or pigs, they were a lifeline. Feeding them through winter was another job entirely. If they survived, so did you. Fields were often shared or collectively maintained, depending on local custom or estate rules. Crop rotation wasn't optional. It was how you kept the soil alive. 1 year wheat, 1 year legumes, 1 year fallow. It was like a team sport where if one neighbor slacked, everyone paid for it. There were no second chances. Roman peasants weren't trained agronomists, but through generations of trial, error, and desperation, they mastered survival agriculture. Their tools were simple. Their techniques, surprisingly advanced. Because when your life depends on food you grow with your own hands, you figure it out. Fast. After all that work, what ended up on the plate? Usually, not much. After toiling from sunup to sundown, you'd hope Roman peasants sat down to a proper meal, maybe something hearty, filling, delicious. Well, not exactly, unless your idea of luxury is a steaming bowl of barley porridge for the third time this week. The peasant diet was simple, repetitive, and deeply tied to whatever the land provided. Barley and spelt were the staples, ground into flour, baked into coarse flatbread, or boiled into a thick porridge called pulse. This mushy mix was often the main course. Lentils, chickpeas, onions, and cabbage rounded things out when available, along with wild greens or herbs if you were lucky. Drinks? Wine. Sort of. It was cheap, sour, and heavily diluted with water to make it stretch and to make the water safer. It barely resembled what we call wine today. Fresh water alone could be a gamble, especially near livestock or stagnant sources. Meat was rare. You might get a few scraps during religious festivals, weddings, or funerals, especially if a pig had been sacrificed. Eggs and cheese were valuable sources of protein, but they weren't everyday fare. Olive oil was prized like liquid gold, but peasants were clever. They preserved what they could: sun-dried figs, beans in sealed jars, pickled turnips, salted fish. Even in harsh seasons, they learned to stretch supplies through ingenuity and tradition. And when food was scarce, you got creative with what you had, or went hungry. Which brings us to where they cooked, ate, and slept. A place that redefined the idea of cozy. If you're imagining a charming countryside cottage, think again. Roman peasant homes were small, cramped, and built with one goal: keep the rain out and the animals in. Most homes were one-room structures made from mud brick or stone, with thatched roofs and no insulation to speak of. A whole family might live, eat, and sleep in a space smaller than your living room, often alongside chickens, goats, or even a pig if they had one. The floor? Dirt, sometimes packed down and covered with straw. The walls? Wattle and daub, sticks woven like baskets, smeared with a mix of mud, straw, and manure. Surprisingly, it held up for years with regular patching. Windows were rare, usually just small holes plugged with cloth, parchment, or wood, and they let in more smoke than sunlight. At the center of it all was the fire pit. This wasn't just for cooking, it was the heater, the dryer, the smokehouse, and the main light source once the sun went down. No chimney meant the smoke just floated upward, blackening rafters and lungs alike. But in an accidental stroke of brilliance, that same smoke helped preserve the roof by repelling insects that liked to nest in the straw. Bathrooms? Not indoors. You walked outside to a pit, which wasn't exactly ideal in the middle of winter. And because everyone lived close together, privacy was something you gave up at birth. Still, as rough as it sounds, this tiny, smoky home was a fortress against the outside world and a symbol of resilience. Owning land was a dream for the elite. For peasants, it was never reality. Most rural workers were tenant farmers, often bound to estates owned by wealthy elites, senators, generals, or absentee landlords who may have never set foot on the property. Some were later called colony, tenant farmers legally tied to the land, almost like medieval serfs. But during most of the empire, they were simply poor laborers working land they didn't own. These landowners got the lion's share of the harvest, often without lifting a finger. Peasants paid rent to the landowner, taxes to the empire, and offerings to the gods. What they kept could barely feed their families. Some years, they were lucky to keep 30% of what they grew. Think of it as working an entire week and only keeping one day's wages, except you still had to feed your family, maintain your tools, and survive the winter. Miss a quota? There were consequences. Fines, beatings, or repossession of critical tools or animals. Losing your only ox could mean the end of your farm, and you couldn't simply leave and try your luck elsewhere. Many peasants were legally tied to their land. Moving without permission was illegal and often punished harshly. To make things worse, Roman bureaucracy was vast and confusing. You might owe labor, grain, animals, or coin, all tracked by scribes who didn't care how many hailstorms hit your field. There was no such thing as tax relief. For Roman peasants, religion wasn't a once-a-week event. It was baked into daily life. Every home had its own collection of household gods. The lares and penates guarded the pantry and protected the family's food supply. Vesta watched over the hearth. Janus, the god of beginnings, had to be consulted before any major action. even planting seeds or traveling to the next village. Forget to leave out an offering? Break a ritual? You risked offending the gods. And a bad harvest, sick livestock, or worse. People genuinely believed that divine forces shaped their fortunes, and they lived in fear of forgotten prayers or improperly performed ceremonies. Peasants also practiced a mix of old folk traditions and Roman state religion. Offerings were buried at crossroads, omens were read from animal behavior, and special charms were tied to children's wrists or worn around necks to ward off illness and misfortune. Festivals like Saturnalia or the Consualia brought moments of joy and community celebration, but they also served religious purposes. Participating wasn't optional. You honored the gods, or you invited disaster. And when things went wrong, people didn't blame bad luck. They blamed curses, angry gods, or neighbors whose goat mysteriously stayed healthy while yours dropped dead. If you were a Roman peasant and you got sick, you had two options: pray or improvise. Doctors existed, but they were rare, expensive, and mostly served the rich. For everyone else, healthcare was a mix of home remedies, herbal lore, and a whole lot of guesswork. Garlic was a go-to for infections. Boiled herbs helped with fevers. Vinegar was used to clean wounds. Honey, surprisingly, made an excellent salve. It had natural antibacterial properties that modern science now confirms. Moldy bread? Oddly enough, that sometimes helped with infections, by accident. It contained mold similar to what later became penicillin, though Romans didn't know why it worked. But for every smart remedy, there were plenty of bizarre ones. Got a toothache? Some believed you should spit into a frog's mouth and release it into the wild. Others recommended rubbing your gums with mouse fat. We do not advise either. Injuries were constant. Farming was physical, and accidents were common. A bad cut, an infected blister, or a broken bone could become life-threatening. Surgery, if attempted, came with no anesthesia, just alcohol and bravery. Trepanning, the practice of drilling into the skull to relieve headaches or seizures, was performed with hand tools. And shockingly, some patients survived. Medicine was brutal, but it was better than nothing. But even with wounds and sickness, life didn't pause. If anything, moments of joy were seized even harder. Life for Roman peasants wasn't just endless labor and hardship. Believe it or not, they still managed to have fun, and they took their chances to celebrate seriously. Whether it was a wedding, a successful harvest, or a religious feast day, the entire village came together. The work stopped, the wine flowed, and for a moment, life felt a little lighter. Music was a big part of these gatherings. Instruments didn't need to be fancy. Peasants made do with flutes carved from reeds, hand drums, or even pots and pans. Dancing was communal and spirited, with traditional steps passed down through generations. Storytelling, especially around fires, was a favorite evening activity. The stories were often myths, local legends, or gossip turned epic adventure. Children had their own games. Hoops, stones, and handmade dolls kept them busy. Adults, meanwhile, enjoyed gambling with knucklebones and shared jokes that probably haven't aged well. And then there was Saturnalia, a chaotic winter festival where roles reversed, gifts were exchanged, and even slaves got to feast. For once, the lines of class and duty blurred, if only temporarily. But behind the joy was something deeper. These gatherings reinforced bonds that made everyday hardship survivable, especially within the tight fabric of the family. In Roman peasant life, family wasn't just important, it was everything. A household wasn't just a nuclear family, it was often multi-generational. Parents, children, grandparents, aunts, uncles, and sometimes even neighbors lived under one roof or within shouting distance. It was loud, messy, and absolutely necessary for survival. Everyone had a role. Women weren't confined to the home. They managed it, yes, but they also worked in the fields, cared for livestock, and spun wool for clothes or trade. Men handled the heaviest labor, repaired tools, and were often conscripted for military or seasonal work. Children had jobs too, scaring birds from crops, collecting firewood, and helping with meals. Marriage was a transaction first, a partnership second, and love, if you were lucky, a distant third. A good match meant a family could gain land access, a useful skill, or livestock. Dowries weren't optional, but love still found a way. Graffiti, love tokens, and local legends hint at real emotion in a world ruled by duty. And when disaster struck, people leaned on each other. If someone lost a harvest or their ox, neighbors stepped in. These informal support systems weren't written into law, but they were often more dependable than any government edict, which was critical, because when things went wrong, they went very wrong. In a world with no crop insurance, no food banks, and no emergency services, Roman peasants had to be incredibly resilient. And they were. Natural disasters, droughts, and unexpected plagues were part of life. So was inflation. When grain prices spiked, people had to improvise or go hungry. One key to survival was preparation. Grains were stored in sealed clay jars or underground pits, protected with pitch or straw to keep out moisture and rodents. Fruits were dried, beans preserved, fish salted, vegetables were pickled in vinegar. Even cabbage was fermented into a kind of Roman sauerkraut. If food ran low, creativity kicked in. Acorns, wild herbs, or even weeds were added to stews. Bread was stretched thin, and everything edible was saved, reused, or recycled into the next day's meal. There was no waste, because there couldn't be. In extreme cases, families buried emergency stores beneath their homes or fields, hiding them from tax collectors or thieves. Some peasants sought safety through mobility, joining the military for guaranteed rations, or taking desperate measures like joining the military for rations, or working under harsh short-term labor contracts in exchange for food and shelter. Community and caution made survival possible, but it was always a tightrope walk. One bad season from disaster, one good harvest from hope. So, what was life like for a Roman peasant? It was tough, dirty, uncertain. You worked from sunrise to exhaustion, gave away most of what you grew, and lived in a house that doubled as a chicken coop. But it was also full of quiet strength, of families who stuck together, of communities that survived by helping each other, of clever hacks, deep traditions, and little moments of joy carved into a hard life. Roman peasants weren't gladiators or senators, but they were the hands that fed the empire, quite literally. If you enjoyed this window into everyday ancient life, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories from the forgotten side of history. Got a question about Roman life? Or want us to explore how peasants lived in another part of the world? Drop it in the comments. We'd love to dig into it. Until then, thanks for watching, and remember, next time you complain about your job, at least you don't have to drag a wooden plow through rocky soil with no shoes.